Hello and welcome to this video. My name is Barry Beckham. In a recent video I mentioned that if I was considering a black and white image, I'd start that manipulation process with the original raw image. I wouldn't just take a colour image and remove the colour in Photoshop. Now, I'm not saying that I've never done that in the past. I have many times, but image editing and our skill levels improve with time. There, did you know I'm like a fine old bottle of wine? Well, maybe not. I don't think creating a black and white as an afterthought is generally the best way to go. If we see the potential as we're browsing our images, then creating that black and white right from the start, from the original raw file, is probably more likely to get a better result. So what is it that makes me think black and white while I'm looking at colour images? Well, sometimes it's just because the colour isn't adding a great deal to the picture. And under those circumstances, and as long as the image has appeal elsewhere, then we have little to lose but to try a black and white conversion. And when I say appeal elsewhere, I mean something that's well exposed, good composition, good interesting content. Taking the colour from a mediocre colour image is not likely to make that image any better. Now, after saying I'm looking for good exposure, I am actually beginning this process with an image which I think I should have given a little more exposure to. I don't think another stop exposure would have done any serious damage to the highlights in the sky, and it would have lifted the rocks on the right and maybe the trees in the distance. But maybe it's worth taking just a few seconds to analyse why an experienced photographer got their picture slightly underexposed. Not that far that we can't redeem it, but it would have been better to start with a better example. Well, first of all, we've got two people walking into the picture in the perfect spot. So by the time you look at the LCD on the back of the screen, adjust the exposure and then get back for a second shot, the people are in the middle of the screen or maybe even clambering over those rocks, which is what they did to get to the sea. The main problem here is that our camera is just a dumb machine. It doesn't know it's taking a picture of a beach scene with quite a lot of bright clouds. So what it does is look at the overall scene and it just sees shades of grey. It sees the bright sky and decides to give less exposure than the image actually requires. I think it's probably one of the most common problems we deal with on a day-to-day basis. So this image fits the scenario I was describing earlier. The colour isn't doing a great deal for this shot at all, so we don't have a great deal to lose by considering a black and white manipulation. The sky's pretty good, I think, and I am sure we can add some impact there. The composition is also pretty good, with the horizon nicely on that lower rule of thirds line, along with the rocks on the right hand side, which are pointing inwards, which also helps. Plus we have the two people walking into the picture, and I'm sure we can make them stand out just a little better than they currently do. The image also has those leading lines we often hear about. The rocks on the right are pointing towards the horizon, and the tide line and the wet sand on the left does the same thing. And with the people walking that way too, well, that helps. I'm going to start the manipulation by just dealing with the bottom half of this image first, just the dark tones. I'm going to open that up as a smart object into Photoshop and then make a duplicate. Then open the duplicate back up into Adobe Camera Raw and adjust the sky, blending the two with a layer mask. Now, a good question here is, does this give us an advantage to work like this with layers and masks? Well, if you asked me that a couple of years ago, I probably would have said yes. But as more and more editing options have been added to radial filters, graduated filters and adjustment brushes in Adobe Camera Raw and of course Lightroom, then any advantage is far less now, if at all. Everything I'm going to do using Photoshop, we could do directly in Adobe Camera Raw. It's just a different way of working that I find a little more convenient. I enjoy working this way. So let's make a start. So we need to start, I think, with the black and white conversion. There's a couple of ways we can do that. If we go down to the Basic tab, what I tend to do myself is just to go down to the saturation and remove it. And I begin from there. But there's other ways we can do this. I'll double click to reset that, because up at the top here, we do have a black and white option here. What's the best? To be honest, I don't think any of them are better than each other. Just make a choice and go with it. What we can do sometimes though is click the Auto button. Now, because we're working on a raw file, we're not locked into the changes that Auto setting has made. But sometimes it gives us a good idea of where we need to go. Now, as I look down at the bottom of this image, it hasn't done a bad job. I think I'd like to stretch the whites a little bit, so I may look at moving the whites up a little bit. Now, if I keep looking up at the top right of that histogram, you can see you've got a clipping warning. If I go too far, it's going to light up. So I don't want to go too far, but I did have a bit more scope than the auto setting suggested. I think the blacks are fine. I don't want to go any further down. The auto settings pushed up the shadows, which I think we needed, certainly on the right hand side and maybe in the distance above the surface, but who knows, we may darken that a little bit. But I would like to put in a really healthy amount of clarity, and that starts to give us a fair degree of sparkle here. We could even try sometimes a little bit of dehaze, but I think in the foreground I'm not going to be too worried. But if we look around here, we can see we've got a bit of a weak area with slightly lighter tones just behind the two surfers and also down at the bottom right corner. We may also want to darken the foreground a little bit as well. Now I think I'll have a go at that with graduated filters. They seem to me to be about the quickest and easiest ways to work here. So going up to the right hand side, I'll select it. I'm going to go down and do the left hand side to start with. Just going to drag up that area there. You can see the area now that was a little bit weak, but I've got some settings from a previous change, so I'm going to right click and reset those and touch the V key. The V key just hides that selection, but I'm going to go back to my exposure now and just drop that down a little bit. Maybe I'll investigate a little more clarity to give that a little more sparkle. You can see the sort of things I'm doing, a little bit of whites maybe back to the exposure. You can see the sort of thing. Now I'm going to touch the V key again. We don't have to do this, but so it's not too I'll say that again. So it's not too confusing when we apply a second graduated filter. We can see exactly where we're going. So bottom right corner, do the same again perhaps. There we seem to need a little bit more change on the lighter tones. So maybe we can go to the highlights here and darken those down. And we can darken down the exposure a little more. And then finally, maybe one up from the bottom just to hold the base of the image in. Remember, what we're doing here is changeable at any time. So all we need to do at the moment, I think, is to get a sort of a broad brush feel for how we want the base of the image to be. And I'm almost certain I'm going to need to lighten the boards here, maybe some of the surf, maybe the water that's running down there, and maybe even this area here, where if you remember, all of those leading lines were pointing us. But for now, I'm going to click the Open Object button down at the bottom right and open this up into Photoshop. Through all this, I've ignored any changes in the sky. Once the image opens up into Photoshop, we need to go to the layers. We can see we're working with a smart object here. That little symbol at the bottom right corner tells us that we can double click this thumbnail at any time, go back into Camera Raw and make any changes we wish to make. And maybe we will as the manipulation progresses. But for the moment, I need a duplicate of this. So move your cursor to the right of the thumbnail, right click and select New Smart Object via Copy. Doesn't really matter which one of these we select now because they're now both independent. But if I take the top image of the two and double click, you'll see we're straight back into Adobe Camera Raw. So now I want to just turn my attention to the sky. Sometimes it's an advantage to reset all of these sliders when we're going to work on the sky, but not all the time, because we probably do want to drop the highlights down. So let's drop them down a little more. Let's take the shadows off by double clicking, and we'll take the whites off for a moment, and I'll take the blacks off, but I'll leave the highlights down, and then I'm going to bring the exposure down. Now I want to improve the contrast. If we look up at the histogram at the top right, it seems to be suggesting that we could do with more white. So let's look at the whites now. And there you can see we can go quite a long way before that little light comes on at the top right. Probably a lot further than we really need to go. We can take a look at even a little more clarity, which is mid-tone contrast. Maybe we'll now look at the blacks too. And also a little bit of dehaze. And we're beginning to put some impact into that sky. We're not sure just how much impact we need. And it's not until we get the sky blended with a layer mask in Photoshop with the base that we'll be able to tell. But of course we're working on two smart objects, so even if it's slightly out of balance, we can correct it quickly, easily, and without any loss in quality. I'm going to suggest the top of the sky is a weakness, so I'm going to try to lean on that quite heavily. To do that, I'm going to use a graduated filter. Click and drag down. And I'll drop the exposure a little more. I'm going to stop at that point because I'm not entirely sure where I need to go. I'd like to move on to the next stage and see the sky joined with the foreground before I make my next decision. So here I'm going to click OK, and that layer that we made a duplicate of is updated with the settings that I've just given it. So what we need to do next then is to apply a layer mask to this layer. Down at the bottom left of the layers we can do that, click to apply it. What I want to do is to use a graduated filter here. So I'm going to go over to the left hand side. I want to make sure I've got black as my foreground color. There's my gradient tool, not graduated filter, but it's going to have exactly the same effect here. And from the options at the top of the screen, I want the linear mode, which is generally the default. It's the one on the left of those 5. And in this option here, we've already got it set, but in the basics, we want this option, which is foreground to transparent. I can now click and draw a line, much the same as we did in Adobe Camera Raw, and define where my mask is going to be applied. Where the mask is black, it's going to reveal the layer beneath, which you know is a much lighter foreground. So I'm going to hold my Shift key, and that keeps the line perpendicular. I'm just going to draw it up across the horizon, and there we get the first look at how the image looks with the sky, which we've manipulated independently to the foreground. And I'm going to suggest maybe either the sky is a little too dark, but I quite like it as it is, or the foreground maybe is a little bit too light. Now, probably one of the most important things we can do now is to save this as a Photoshop file. A Photoshop file, as you probably know, retains the layers, the masks, and it also retains that smart object status. So even if we come back to this image tomorrow, we're still working on raw files. And there's a plus there too. When we're in full creative flow, which we are here, there's a tendency for a fog to come down over our senses, and sometimes we don't always see the obvious. If we can leave this file and come back in a couple of hours' time, or overnight, it's amazing what you see in the cold light of the next day or a little break from the work. So to darken down the foreground just a little bit, I don't want to darken down the highlights. In fact, I probably want to raise those. So what we need to do is to select that layer, the layer that contains the foreground, double click and open this back up into Camera Raw. I think first of all I'll take a look at the blacks. I'll just drop the blacks a little bit to darken that foreground down. I think that's all it's going to need, because it didn't need very much. But to adjust the highlights, I'm going to select an adjustment brush, and I'll hold the control key, click and drag to get my surface very large on screen, because what I want to do here is to lighten the surfboards. So what I need to do is to probably push up the exposure a little bit, and maybe the highlights a little bit, even the whites a little bit. We'll see how that goes. You can see I've got the flow set very low here, and you can see the size of the brush I have. And what I'm looking to do here is to raise the tones. I'm going to need to make my brush smaller, and I'm going to need to take a bit of care around the edge here. But you can see exactly what I'm doing. So to save us a little bit of time, and to save you getting bored watching me do something which is pretty simple, because once I've done that, I'm going to go over to this board and have a go there. Once I've done that, I'll zoom out and we'll take a look at where we need to go next. Now, as you can see here, I've zoomed out just a little bit. You'll also notice that I used a different adjustment brush for each of those boards. I found the one here was reacting to my changes a little bit greater than the one on the left, so they needed a slightly different level of change, but no problem with that. But what I want to do now is to start a new brush somewhere along this waterline here. So I'm just going to click and drag just for a moment. I'm going to right click on the pin and reset. I'm going to go up and adjust my feather. You can see I took a lot of the feather off when I was doing those boards, but I'm going to push it back up now. But what I want to do is just lift the highlights a little bit, lift the whites a little bit, maybe a little bit of exposure. Then I want to just wipe along these areas. Maybe I need to zoom in as well. And what I may also need to do is to just look over on the right hand side to the flow. The flow looks quite low, so maybe I've got a little too much in the settings here. So I'm going to back off a little bit. These are the sorts of things you'll be doing all of the time. So a nice big brush here, painting down to lift the highlights. And along that line, because we know that's a nice strong point pushing us into the picture. That's not looking too bad at all. A little bit more up here maybe. And now I can investigate one or two other places. Zooming in once again. Along here maybe, just lifting it slightly. And along this area too. Maybe around that area, just to lift where all of those leading lines are pointing. And down at the bottom here, I'll zoom out, because what I was thinking of is just a little more lightness down the right hand side behind that rock, just a little bit there. So you can see I'm just enhancing the way we're looking and focused into that middle distance. So what I'm going to do next is to open this back up into Photoshop. Every time we do this, of course, it's going to be updated, and there we can see the change. The one part of this I'm not too keen on is the gradient that I've got on my mask. I think is affecting these areas maybe a little too much. So if I wanted to adjust that, I'm going to select the mask itself. I'm going to pick up black as my foreground color from the color picker, a soft edge brush, but I'm not going to try to brush along the edge here or make a selection along the edge. I need a big brush like this. But if you look up at the top of the screen, you'll notice I've got the opacity set for 100% and the flow set to 1%. Because now I'll do a little bit of masking, or you could say, I suppose, yeah, a little bit of extra masking just along those areas, just to lessen the impact of that mask. So we just get a hint in the background, and I think that just improves matters a little bit. Now, there's a number of different things we can do. I'm going to put a vignette on this. I'd like to do something with the sky at the top left edge. It's a little bit light there, but I think at this stage I would be saving this as another version, and maybe we can consider actually merging the two together and doing the rest of the work using the tools of Photoshop. So once I've saved this as a Photoshop file, I've got everything I've done so far safe. I'm going to go to the top right and choose Flatten Image. And we're going to move on a little bit. I'm going to pick up my Burn tool from the toolbox. Adjust the brush, the size. I'm looking at highlights. I've got an exposure of 10%. That may be a little bit heavy, so I'll hit 0.5 to drop that down, because it's that area up at the top middle there that I just want to kill a little bit, and a little bit there too. Now there's one or two other places. What we could do right at the top there, and I've done this a few times, is to go down to our layers, bottom right, create a new blank layer. We could create quite a light gradient from the top downwards. To do that, let me just zoom out a little bit, give myself a little bit of space around the edge. So here I'm going to pick up black as my foreground color. Once again, the gradient tool, same options as before. I'm going to start outside the picture space because I don't need it to be solid black along there. Just drag it down a little bit. That's a little bit heavy, so I'm going to start a little bit further up and come down. And we can always adjust this by adjusting the opacity. Maybe I'd like it a bit stronger now I've looked at it. That's the sort of thing. See how it starts to match the base of the image there a lot more. Control 0. These are all things you can do. I'm not suggesting they're always the things that you would do. Now, if you look at my image, I've dealt with the tones at the top. I've dealt with the tones at the bottom. It's not too bad on the right hand side, but I'm going to suggest still that it may be still a little bit weak on the left hand side, but not very much. So maybe I'll just select a selection tool here. Just make a quick selection around here, something like that. I do need to make it very soft, so select a mask is something I would use, something up in the probably 400s, maybe a little less, but something like that. I'll hit Control H to hide that, and I'm going to bring up my levels. Control L, you'll find them in your image menu, and I've just realized I've made a mistake because I've still got that layer selected. I need this one selected. So once again, I'll go back to those levels, Control L. Just want to move the mid-tone slider, look, just a little bit to the right, just to hold that left-hand end in nicely. And while I'm in the layers over on the right, I'm happy with that gradient at the top. So I'm going to flatten the image. Now with the spinning round of the screen, all I've done is a little bit of burning of the shadows in the sky and one or two places. A couple of touches with the dodge tool on the highlights, again in the lighter tones in the sky, and a little bit more on the water and the wet sand. I've also extended the image a little bit on the width. I added about 400 pixels without adjusting the height. We do that in the image menu, image size, just uncheck the chain link, and I've just given my picture a little bit more of a landscape, or in this case seascape, look. Let's compare that to what we started with. We can make quite a difference between the image we started with and the image we create. What tools and methods we use is not written in stone. But any modern photographer must become competent with some image editing skills. Those who think they can sidestep them will always play second fiddle to those who don't. Taking our images from the initial button press right through to a good quality and powerful image is very rewarding, and it gives us a sense of achievement. I'll see you next time.